We have an impressively small crew today. Usually we have about 30 people. It's nice, the intimacy. It gives us a little bit more space. So allow yourselves to close your eyes and to, if anyone else is coming on and you want to just say in the chat room your name and where you're coming in from and what calls you here, then please know that your voice is welcome and appreciated. I personally like watching this. You can watch my video on Spotlight, which is how it is right now. When we go into conversation, I love putting everyone in gallery view so I can actually see everybody. And that's the very top right corner that looks like a little Rubik's Cube. And if you ever have questions throughout our time together, at the bottom of your screen, if you scroll over it, there's a little chat box. And you can always throw in some commentary or questions over there. And I really enjoy your voices. So there's going to be a couple times when I will ask questions. And it's your voice feeds our conversation, your ponderings, your thoughts. So I really do invite that. And if it's not, then we'll just keep talking. So let's begin with our eyes closed. And if your video is off and you're doing the dishes, I just invite you to give yourself this moment. Really allow yourself to have this moment to close your eyes, to sit down, and to just start noticing this temple of your body, this vessel for story, this being that carries stories, that hears stories, that repeats stories, that generates stories. Just to notice, how is this vessel, this chalice, what state is it in right now? And so you might just want to begin by allowing your eyeballs to even relax, just allowing them to come and sink back and back. And I invite you just to notice, how are you seated? How you're seated tells you so much about how you meet the world. Are you leaning forward? Are you leaning back? Are you slumped over? Without changing it, I'm going to actually ask you to really notice it for a moment. Really notice, does it feel good, your natural position? Does it feel delightful? And taking a nice deep breath from this position without changing anything, without making stories up about if it's right or wrong. Just noticing. And in your noticing, you might feel a call for alignment. And so in that, I invite you to bring in a nice deep breath. And as you bring in this really deep breath, you might want to feel a natural desire to make some space for it. So your spine might lift up if it was crunched down a little bit. And as you breathe in, even breathing into the back of your lower back. And then slowly exhaling. Squeezing that air out, bringing your belly button back to your spine. And just notice what other parts of your body want to come into alignment as you do this. I invite you to continue just with your own breath. As storytellers, we're the seers of the world. We're the ones that are seeing past the first layer of the words. We're looking into the heart of the voice that speaks. We're listening for the intention of the creator. We're listening for the origin of the story. And we're paying attention to, intending the times that that story began and what that story was in service to. And as story carriers, we have this exceptional opportunity of discernment to choose, what stories do we choose to carry? Which stories will we take into our body and give our precious life force to repeat? We ask what stories are most needed and necessary in the times that we're in, as we wonder about what are you in service to. And so I invite you into that simple inquiry right now. What are you in service to? And allow whatever wants to emerge to come forth without having to understand it even. Because what you're in service to will inform what choices and what stories you choose to carry and repeat. If you're in service to connection, love, tenderness, honesty, it's a certain kind of story you will carry. If you're in service to healing, there's a certain story you will carry. And if you're in service to fear, to hate, to separation, there's a certain kind of story that you will carry. So I invite you in this time to double down on your listening as we go through this class. Listening for who you are, to what you're wanting to be and belong to what you're calling for. And as we go on this adventure into the world of sacred story together, may those wonderings start to be whispered to. I'm going to start you with a quote. The business of stories is not enchantment, and the business of stories is not escape. The business of stories is waking up. And that quote is by Martin Shaw. I love that quote because if you're not familiar with Martin Shaw, look him up on YouTube. We're very lucky to have a true bard, carrying the old ways and the old stories with us. And what I love about this quote is that it speaks to that element of the journey of the storyteller. That we have the story of the original indigenous storytellers would go from village to village. They were treasured and valued members. And they brought news, and they carried the history, and they reminded people who they were. And then, we can go forward towards another kind of archetypal energy of storyteller, which is the bard. The bard this was a very romanticized role in the, times of King Henry's. I don't know my history that well. But those kinds of storytellers had to sing for their dinner. They could get in a couple of jabs of truth here and there, but their main job was to entertain. They couldn't really speak truth. And here we are in our time, as our consciousness is continuing to evolve, as we're beginning to understand more and more about our true capacity as humans, and what it means to be a storyteller, and what it means to be a creator. And so this idea of, to carry a story actually is to be a part of a waking up and a great reveal. And I'm just going to say this because I don't usually say this right now, but because we're in this strange times, and some might say that we're apocalyptic times. If you don't know the etymology of apocalypse, it comes from Greek, and it means a reveal. It's a lifting of the veils. So it's a time to celebrate being the apocalypse, because we get to see what's really there. And as storytellers, we are carrying the framing, the narrative. We're bringing meaning making to the times that we're living in. And so some might hear that word and say, the sky is falling, run for cover. Others might say, the curtains have been pulled back. Let me see what is here. So now I can relate now I can name and speak those things that I've been feeling the whole time. Okay. So here's what we're going to accomplish together. I'm going to introduce you to storytelling as a sacred art form. So this is not your normal 6 bullet pointed class about how to use a storytelling to market. I think you guys probably know that since you're here with me. But I'm going to introduce you to the big landscape, and then we'll hone in on little pieces, looking at story as sacred art. We'll talk about what is a story, why is it relevant to our times. We've already kind of gotten into that. And I'll talk a little bit about what people don't take into consideration, specifically about the power of the listener. And then we'll get into it. We're gonna get to play a little bit. It's a nice small class. We might actually get to hear what people say and create. So we don't usually get to do that, but that's what we're gonna do today. So a little bit about me. I'm just gonna cruise through my history really fast. But I started off in the wilds of a farm in Vermont, and I got to really develop a relationship with the natural world. And I say that because I really say that's where my listening began. And I got into theater and studying theater as a profession very, very young, and went straight to New York City after high school and studied under the tutelage of Sandy Meisner at the Neighborhood Playhouse, and worked a little bit off Broadway and did summer stock, and really got to see what happens in that realm of professional theater, and that there's this magical field that's created. And I got really fascinated by what happens when you kind of build up this energy in this space. And I carried that forward as I continued my own path of getting involved with environmental protection and social justice, and went on to get a master's in social work and worked with youth at risk for many years in the wilderness. But all along, I understood that story had something and that it could catalyze people. But I also felt like there was this missing link between getting people from story to action. And that inquiry ended up leading me to working with Al Gore, this television network where I produced and hosted the Green Channel there. It was really in the belly of how do we give people the information to get them to inspiration and motivation and activation on the planet. And after years of doing that, I discovered that I was asking the wrong question. It wasn't what information do people need. It was actually what story people need. We actually are not computers. We do not metabolize or process data. We are humans, and we are made of stories. We're made of words, not numbers. And so we actually metabolize narrative. That's how we make meaning. So a little fun fact, next time you're in a room with people, that's a very strange thing to say, and someone is spouting off a bunch of data, watch as all the energy in the room goes, whoa. It just like bottoms out. It's the most fascinating thing. It's because we don't have the capacity. So think about that when we're dealing with climate change. Think about that when we're dealing with the virus. We're taking all these numbers, blah, blah, blah. The numbers don't actually help us understand how to find our role and make meaning in the story. We need a narrative for that. So I just went off on a tangent, but there you go. Anyway, I ended up going in the realm of all that, and ended up finding my way after looking at the data that showed me we don't need all the data to bring meaning, that I ended up going back to my original roots, and even more so following the call of how do you work with that energy as a form of a tool for transformation, and got very deeply involved in the original roots of theater, which is back in ritual and ceremony, and building small and large scales rituals and ceremonies out of stories for groups of people. And so it's a little bit of context in terms of where I am meeting you today. So let's just come back to the ancient wisdom about the role of story and the role of language. The Hawaiians believe that words are so powerful that they can raise enough energy to slow the world or set it into motion. So if you ever get to see Hawaiian chant, it's been kind of taken over. Hula's been, taken over by the tourism industry. Again, go to YouTube, and if you watch Hawaiians chant, you understand that this is a indigenous group that never lost their relationship to their ways, and understanding that all of those are prayers. All of the hulas it's a walking, spoken prayer. And so when you listen to it, it's a potent thing to witness. The Sicilians believe that words poke holes in the universe. Think about the last time you were a little heated and said something you'll never be able to take back. The Australians say that the stories of the past need to be sung to the present so that future can exist. The Maoris say that the words don't describe a thing, they are the thing. And all of the ancient religions agree that the world was sung, spoken, and chanted into existence. I want to say that again because it's like one of those mind-blowing, ancient pieces of knowledge that gives us a real key to understanding our unique role on this planet. But all the ancient religions agree that the world was sung, spoken, and chanted into existence. So any story that you hear that says people are bad for the planet, I invite you to just place that story to the side and go back to this key piece that shows our unique place that we play in the universe, perhaps even a cosmological perspective, how magical this planet is, and our unique role on it, and how powerful our words are. So then as we start to understand this, now we have to go back to understanding, okay, well, let's get down to it. And I'm going to ask you a question. It's a real question. I invite you to answer. And the question is, what is a story? What is a story? And you can, there's no right or wrong answer. We'll all have different versions of it. And you might actually have an idea of what you want to say, or I can invite you into the practice of eloquence. So there's two different ways that we might speak. Some of us are used to being very strategic and clever and focused on the precision of language that we use. And that's great. There's something to be said for that. And then there's a form of eloquence where you're doing this collaboration with that creative life force. You can call it the muse, you can call it the ancestors, you can call it the guides, you can call it the earth speaking out loud, you can call it God, whatever you relate to. I just like to call it that creative life force. And so you take a nice deep breath and you set into this collaboration, this wondering, what is story? And you really allow the inspiration to just flow through you. And we can just practice. Sometimes it works great, and sometimes it doesn't. And that's okay. It's just, it's just what happens. So I'm gonna take a look. You can raise your hand. Oh, most of you are off video. You guys are such a quiet group. I invite you to come on video, and thank you for your comment, Kathy. So what is a story? What do we know as a collective about what is a story? Yes.
I think it's perspective. It's a moment, and it's your perspective of an event, whether it's a personal or interior or exterior. But I think it's a moment.
I love what you're saying too. It's a perspective. One of the things that's so extraordinary about it, it's like stories are, they're very, very elusive. They're sort of like prisons. Wherever you are sitting, 10 people can sit around a story and they can all hear the same story and they'll all hear two different things. Depending on your relationship to linearity and being literal, depending on your relationship to myth, to metaphor, to symbol. I went and saw a movie with it was Captain Marvel with my friend. We saw two different movies. We sat right next to each other and we saw two completely different movies. So I love that. So there's a perspective from the outside, but then there's also, and I want to speak to this, especially because you spoke to working with story in a healing modality. There's also our perspective as telling the story. And I think of stories as trees, as they're living beings. And we don't expect a sapling to stay a sapling its whole life. We expect it to lay roots. We expect it to expand. We expect it to grow, to eventually provide shade, to fruit, and so our stories can do that too. And so, I'm thinking of this story. I was just thinking about this morning. There used to be this story. If I told you this story 10 years ago, it would have been a lion rushing through my life, shredding everything to bits. If I tell you this story today, it's a kitten. And you're like, well, that's cute, no big deal. What happened in the story is the same. I experienced a betrayal. But who I am who I was at the time that I experienced it and the story that I told while I was in it, and who I am on the other side of it, and who I've become because of the medicine that I received from that experience. My story has changed, and who I am and how I tell the story has changed as well.
I love
So
it.
that's that whole perspective piece. Anyone else want to take a gander of what is a story?
I'll take a gander.
Okay.
I believe stories are a collection of memories and just weaved in together to tell a tale of belief.
So you're talking about memories and belief systems. So
Right.
I can view in the esoteric and the literal. So one thing that I just saw, God, we just, I teach a course, we bring in all these great guest teachers. And this one thing that this Laura Sims brought to us, and this was one of the most extraordinarily simple things, but she told a little story, and then she had us all speak to the things that we remembered because of it. And she talked about that stories have this capacity to tap into our past and our history in ways that we can't even explain. I wish I could give you the transmission because it was one of the most simplest, kind of extraordinary, esoteric elements of working with story that I'd ever seen. But when you speak to belief systems, right, they hold our memories. It's like as storytellers, we're holding the history, but I also think that, when we tell a story, especially about a hard thing we've managed our way through, I always think of it as like, hey, I went through the minefield. I remember what it took to get through there. I'm going to show you the path. I'm going to show you to do the breadcrumbs so maybe you can make it through faster. And now we're having an evolutionary experience. Why don't you build your life on stand on my shoulders so you can go a little bit further than I did now that you have this understanding. So it's like we're collectively growing together as we share our memories through the stories, right? Don't have to, I think about the whole Me Too movement. And if more women had felt safer in the world to share their experiences about, just the relational qualities between men and women, then perhaps there would be more women that had the skill to protect themselves from certain situations. But there was such a shaming in that, and so many stories weren't shared. So it's like that is such a prime, raw, ripe example on how stories not shared create situations where we have to repeat the same things over and over again. If we share stories and if we share our histories, then things can change and evolve. The Me Too movement just kind of blew that out of the water. So then now we go into this belief systems piece that you just talked about. And I think of stories in a very unromantic way, that they are an operating system. So if we understand that humans always refer to their bodies as in reference to the latest technology, we used to refer to it as a machine, now computers. So let's say that a story is an operating system. And in that operating system, we learn our belief systems, our values, and what we believe is possible. Think about all the books that you read as a kid, all those stories that were read to you about that. Now let's start thinking about all the Walt Disney movies, especially when many of us were growing up, and what belief systems did those plant about romance and love and the roles that we're supposed to play. I just heard this, I've been teaching this class for so long, and I can't believe I just heard this like in the past month. Television programming, they literally call it programming. It's a program that, again, teaches us and sets us up for the expectations for what life's supposed to look and feel like. So, yes. Anyone else? One last go at what is a story?
Hi.
Mm-hmm. Hi.
Hi. When I first began storytelling, it was Native American stories. And so so they're teaching stories, teaching stories, and also stories that talk about why things are the way they are. The creation stories, the stories about an individual being taken into, snatched away from the tribe and taken down into the water. to learn how the frogs live, and comes back with that gift of telling everyone, this is why we're not seeing the frogs, and we need to create a dance, and we need to create a ceremony. And so that's sort of been my, that's sort of been where I'm at with stories. And which, I mean, I was born in Germany, in southern Germany, and left there when I was 7. I didn't grow up with those fairy tales, but they're also teaching stories, but in a very different way than the Native American stories. And I'm just now starting to look into some of those fairy tales, studying Rapunzel at the moment.
Okay. So I'm going to touch a little bit on what you've spoken to, that I always tell people, if you really want to understand stories and how to become a storyteller, don't go look up the 6 bullet points. Don't look up the hero's journey. Just like, enough. Go look at the creation stories. So what is a myth? A myth is a story that has no claimed owner. It is a free will being. It's kind of amazing. And so a myth is a story that has no owner, and it's carried. They were carried orally for many, many years. So it had to have something in it in order for people to continue to carry it. It had some teaching. It brought some meaning. It taught some value. It taught you how to live in the world. Where do they come from? Nobody knows. And they also have to have a little entertainment in them, right? It's like you have to enjoy them. It's like they're not just nothing. So again, these are stories that have life in them. And that's why I say, go study the creation stories, these stories that are so alive. And once you feel that energy in you, you will know what it is and how to tell a story. You already know how to tell a story. I'll just tell you that. But it's like that resonance in you. It's like it wakes it up inside you. You're like, right, beginning, middle, and end. It's not that hard. It has something in it. It has an offering. There's a purpose. There's a meaning. So the other thing that you just spoke to was the teaching story. And this is kind of a lost art. And I just want to bring this up because it's such a beautiful thing. And I was at Pioneers Conference a couple years ago, and there was a tent committed to Indigenous storytelling, and there was this fellow in there who was talking about, he's probably in his mid-30s, he was talking about, and I wish I could tell you which tribe he was from, I don't know, and I'm sorry about that. But he was saying how he, someone who carries Indigenous stories, had lost his own relationship to teaching stories. And he realized that when he had this 3-year-old, and his 3-year-old was doing all kinds of the wrong things. He was taking food off of people's plates. He was cutting in line. He was all kinds of embarrassed about how his child was behaving in public. And he was also getting caught up in the, no, don't do that, no. And he didn't want to be as that as a parent. And he realized in that moment that he had forgotten how to engage the teaching story. And that when he brought the teaching story to his child, and they went home and they created a story about good otter and bad otter. Good otter does this, bad otter does that. That all of a sudden it was like he had a nanny in the room, and then when they're doing things and they're out in public and they're at home and his son's doing things, he can simply call him the story and say, are you being good otter or bad otter? And now we have this other kind of way to relate and connect that brings us into a bigger conversation than just, the immediate one. So if we go through that and we're like, okay, we have some kind of agreement on what is a story. Now, what's a sacred story? What defines a story as sacred?
I would say that it has an element of just truth to it, like universal truth.
So it has that thing, I call it the inner nod. There's something that's alive that relates us to each other. And that it's not just about me. And this is where I talk about, John Steinbeck says, the storyteller cannot be about you or it will not last. It must be about your reader. So I'll give you a little example later in terms of how to do that. But, when I tell the story of, when I lived through the experience of having cancer, I just told you about thyroid cancer. I'd only be talking to people who've dealt with that, But my story, when you talk about the universal threshold, the initiation that it was, okay. This is about everybody. Everybody goes through thresholds. Everybody goes through initiation. So that's what the core of that story is about. So, right. And you're talking about also a little bit of intentionality. You know, there's an energy that happens in stories. There are moments in stories when we are especially working through something in healing where I need to be witnessed. So when we talk about the healing journey of an experience, when someone uses stories as a transformational tool, there's a moment when they need to be witnessed. And that witnessing, you know, there's something that happens when we call people in, and there's also a declaration to those people. And you tell your listeners what their job is. You say, you ask something of them. You understand that all of your energy, the energy in the room is going, there's always an exchange, right? You're saying, would you please just give me your energy? You know, because I need this to be witnessed. I need this to be heard. There's a transformational arc that happens when we take the story like that and we make it so that it's not just about us, but it's also something that becomes a gift for others. And in the expression of telling that, I always say it sort of looks like this, where all of a sudden there's this metamorphosis happens and the story all of a sudden becomes a gift that I can give away. And that story can even be carried because it's no longer about me. And that is where you start to find those universal truths. That's when you start to declare the medicine. That's when you start to say, oh, this has a gift in it and I can give this away. So thank you for surfacing that part. The thing about that I say about sacred storytelling is that it's a total setup. You know, it's like when I call something sacred, I'm inherently calling something else just by using the word not sacred. So it's a setup. However, we live in a time when that way of seeing the world around us as sacred, as alive, as having the divine within it, as everything having life. Many people do not live in a way that expresses that way of being. So we actually have to call on that language so that we can call that way back towards us again. So when I say the word sacred story, I'm saying a story that has a life inside of it, that has a divine inside of it. I'm also speaking to the intentionality. I'm saying that it's a story that has a purpose and it has a life force that serves life thriving. And so when we look into that kind of thing, okay, well, what does that mean exactly? You know, it has a purpose, it has a meaning, it has a life. You know, I also think of when I go in to create a sacred story, I think of it as a very humble process. My job, the discipline, the practice, is not allowing the egoic brain to even touch the beginning as the story gets called in, as it's created. So I'm talking about the role of creating new stories and listening for stories. This can be done even if I'm telling my own story about, okay, I'm going to tell my story about having cancer, okay? But if I sit down and tell it, if my intention is to create a healing story, a creation story, even that, what if I don't know the story? Can I let go of it? Because it's not about the facts and information. It's about something else, right? And same thing of like, okay, like last night I got a dream about a new story. You know, I don't know what it's about, but I'm really excited. You know, and I think I know what it's about. But even so, if I'm calling on that divine relationship with the muse, with that creative life force, it's this humbleness where your job is to say, egoic brain, where you think that you know the story, or where you think that you know where the story goes, continues to drive out of the way, where you go into the deep sense of listening. And in that deep sense of listening, I feel like is where the deep wisdom can emerge, where there can be things that surface in your stories that you didn't know before, that you didn't even have access for before. And it's kind of this extraordinary expression of getting to be in life. People are like, wow, you're so smart. And you're like, just listen to the wisdom of the story and it came through and I got to be the first to hear it. Yay, you know, gay team. So if we're looking at, okay, so that's a sacred story and it has these universal components. It has a purpose and a meaning. It's here to thrive life. It's here to support life thriving. What is, what's the opposite? You know, and that I would say the zombie story. So a zombie story is a story that's not here to support life. I would say that we are surrounded by zombie stories. So when I talked about that element of discernment at the beginning, I would be discerning about what we listen to. You know, I would really focus on keeping an eye out for zombie stories. So an example for zombie story, it's not here serving life. You don't necessarily feel so good after hearing it. You can hear a really painful, beautiful story. Life is beautiful. What an amazing example of a hard topic of a movie that was told in such an extraordinary way that you could look at the darkest corners of life, and it gave you beauty and grace and courage to do so. That is a sacred story. It dealt with the Holocaust. A zombie story is a story that you see the horrors of life, and that's all that you're left with. It's just the horrors of life, not the skills to make it through, not the ability to make it to the other side. You're left feeling a little bit less of yourself, and maybe people shouldn't be here after all. So think about that when you're watching TV, or when you're watching the news or anything. See how many zombie stories are around you, and start to be discerning of, you can look at them and watch them and analyze them, but do you need to carry them? Is the wondering that I want to invite you into. So Jaws is actually a really good example of a zombie story. It's a cautionary tale. It was written by Peter Benchley. It was picked up by Steven Spielberg. It was the very first film that Steven Spielberg ever made, and that film was actually the first film that was ever shot out on the open ocean. So a couple things about now we're talking about symbols, right? Because the ocean is the symbol of our consciousness. Whether or not you speak the language consciously of symbol, you are still made of an old human type that speaks in this way. And so now we have this film with a shark that broke, and mechanical shark, as they shot, images, parts of it. So when people were watching it, it was very much the shark immediately ran into this element of becoming symbolic of, because we're not seeing a fake shark, right? We're just seeing pieces of it. So it goes straight into symbol mode, right into our consciousness. It's in the ocean, and sharks become a symbol of our fear of the unknown and our fear of death. And that movie was single-handedly responsible for the kill-off and mass death of that keystone species across the ocean, and a massive fear around an animal that is just not that dangerous. So when Peter Benchley discovered and understood the damaging element of his story on the collective consciousness, he spent the rest of his life trying to undo that damage and became a tremendous ocean steward. So it's a cautionary tale, because I don't think that all the people out there writing zombie stories are intentionally doing it. But this is a time more than ever when I'm doing a call for you to stand in your place as a conscious creator. And you understand the impact that you have on the world, that the stories you tell will ripple and ripple and ripple, and they're going to ignore entropy. Stories ignore entropy. And like everything else in the world that falls apart, they're not made of that kind of matter, and they can keep getting carried and keep getting carried. God only knows how far your story could be carried. So, the one last thing I'm just going to talk about, and then we're going to get to play, is just the role of the listener. I used to go through and show you Venn diagrams, but I think I'm going to skip the Venn diagrams. I think we're staring at like screens too much. But the role of the listener, when I do events, I call them actually co-creators. They're the co-creators of the story. And your job as a storyteller is to understand that it's a complete illusion that you are the one doing all the work in the room. And that if you create that magic space where your listeners are fully focused and engaged, and they are allowing the story that you are giving them as a gift to take root in them, you guys start to create that magical field of co-creation space. And so when you have their focus and their attention, you're doing just a little bit of work. But if they're all fidgety and they're all over the place and things are going on, you never get to step into the magic. And it's just hard work, and it's not that much fun. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do that, and this is the amazing thing about storytelling is that magic place. It's like, I can tell you a story right now. And this little story takes place at the bottom of the ocean. And there's this little fairy. She's very, very small. She's only 2 inches tall. But she's got this long blonde hair. Perhaps it's even 6 feet long. And it drags behind her on the bottom of the ocean floor. And it leaves little sparkles of gold behind her as she walks, step by step. across the ocean floor. So how many of you were able to see that image? Okay. So we reality bended, we time traveled, we location traveled. We did all these things, you know, think of all the VR. It's like all the technology's right here. We just did it, right? We didn't need all this stuff. And what was happening was creating this magic, you know, what I'm calling this magical field of co-creation together. We just co-created a reality. I just decided to co-create a fairy, but I could have created a hero. I could have created a villain. We could have done all kinds of different crazy things together, right? But what I'm calling magic, Princeton calls neural coupling. So my frontal lobe was getting all activated, and the exact same place in your frontal lobe was getting activated. And we were doing this thing called neural coupling. So there's a real transmission. So as I can, in my advanced classes, I talk a little bit more about how to do that and how to do transmission from human to human, but we're not going to get into that right now. What we will get into is just this piece of how do you prepare people to catch your story. So when I do story ceremonies, you know, it starts at the door. It starts at the door. And you need to make sure that your space, that when people come in, they have what's called, what I like to call a Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore moment. Okay. So their reality is getting a little bit shaken up. They're not thinking about the grocery list, and they're not thinking about these other things. You know, this is so weird to be talking about this because times are so different right now. But anyway, let's imagine that we all come into a room together, and I create, in those situations, we would create something where people would come in and again put them into that space of receiving. You know, where we would serve them tea. They don't go serve themselves. We serve them tea. People don't get served very often. You know, again, put them in that space of preparing to receive something. A lot of times when I do story ceremonies, we'll gather around an altar, and there'll be flowers and beauty and all kinds of things there. And what happens there, because, you know, again, we're putting people in relationship to the divine and beauty. And so that's just one of the things that, you know, and you can, okay, that's a nice thing. That's a sacred circle. Maybe you don't do a sacred circle. You know, when I did a talk at Google, I handed each person a rose when they walked in. I asked them to smell it before they said their name, just to bring them into relationship with their senses. I did the exact same thing with you who were here at the beginning of the call. I asked you to go inward, and I gave you a task. I asked you to listen for yourself and what you're attending to this class, as if it was going to speak to you in that way. So I gave you the task of a certain kind of focalized listening. So those are all kind of little hints. And one time I heard, I got this great feedback from a teacher. She said that giving her students a task in listening changed the way that her classrooms operated. So it's one of the key things. Okay, so any questions thus far? Comments?
Could you really speak again about your explanation of myth? You mentioned myth and your definition of myth.
Sure. So there's a couple of ways that you can, I mean, if you want to get just technical, you know, and the technical piece, a myth is a story that has no owner. It has no author. It's something that's been carried and carried. A myth, it often gives us a little bit of guidance about how to live in the world. It carries some piece of information, some piece of piece. Some people, I was just reading this beautiful book last night. Actually, let me get it. Let me get it, because it actually has a whole line on myths being a relationship with gods. This is an old book, Myths of the Heroes. You know, one of the thrills of being home right now is I'm going through all my I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it that fast for you. Okay, look at this. Your perfect question. So modern metaphysicians such as Schelling believe that the myth expresses a real relationship of human consciousness to God. The anthropologists discovered that all primitive people are haunted by the great phenomena of nature, the rhythmic alternation of light and darkness, and the rising and setting of the sun each day, and the cyclical movement of the seasons. All peoples throughout the world performed and still perform certain ceremonies accompanied by liturgy and attended by magical formulas consisting of names and numbers. Use of magic was primitive man's attempt to control the forces of nature and to bend it to his will. Centuries after such ceremonies were replaced by religious, the liturgies remained, becoming more and more mysterious as the original pageants were forgotten. So these liturgies were the ancestors of the myth. So, I mean, they used to say that all myths did accompanied by a ceremony. And when we look back at the oldest origin of acting even, this is different than myth, because myth is different than acting, but we're kind of weaving in different worlds. What I'll say is that the very first actor was doing a ritual ceremony to Dionysus. And so what are our actors, but they are channeling the gods to live among us. So when you look at, why are we so fascinated by celebrity stars? So they've got this like energy that's like very compelling, so this godliness in them, so some people will even say it's a shamanic component to it. And so we'll just stop there, because that's a much bigger, deeper conversation, but that's one way of looking at it. But the key definition, when you look at like the scholarly definition of a myth, it's a story that has no author. It's been carried through time, comes from the oral traditions. Okay. Shall we create together for a few moments? Okay, I can give you a couple different ways to play. We can either I can give you a recipe for creating your own wisdom story. And that will actually take us up to the hour. I would send you off on your way. Or we could do a little free write with a dream story. So the people who are in the video get to determine what we're going to do next, because I can see you. If you want to get the recipe for creating your own wisdom threshold story, place your hand up. If you want to do a dream story, place your hand up. Okay, I think I got 2 for dream stories. Is that right? Okay, great. So this is.
Wait, hold on. Can you just go over which is which for the dream story, and what's the difference between the two?
Okay, yeah, very big difference. So the wisdom and threshold story, I give you a recipe. So I'll give you like the 6, 4 or 5 main points of how to create a threshold story. The dream story is something else. The dream story is where we'll just do a little free write, and what we'll do is we'll each have 8 minutes to play, or 5 minutes to play with picking up one section of a dream that we've recently had and listening for the story that wants to be revealed to us through that. And you get to kind of practice that emergent creative process. Should we vote once more, since now you understand more? Okay, who wants the 6 points of creating a wisdom threshold story? 2 people, 3 people, okay. So here you go. So first of all, pick an issue that is challenging. Pick an issue that's challenging in your life. This is a moment that really sucked. It could be a relationship breakup. It could be getting fired from a job. It could be living through a virus. It could be anything. But actually, this is too soon. So this is not the right topic for this particular kind of story. This is something that you are on the other side of. So if you're still right, this is not your time to tell the story. If you can potentially listen and hear something else that you don't know is exactly how you thought it was, then you can start to tell the story. So pick that issue. What I love to do is go back to where does the story really begin? So what I'm doing is I'm creating, I call this a recipe because I don't know about you, but I can't
admit, I was like, it is like, oops. I could do this diet because it tastes so good, It's like
diet. I want to know what diet that was. Hold on. So
what was that?
Oh, let's see here. I'm trying to. Okay. So when you go to this piece, when you're looking for this story, you want to go back to like where. So the reason why I call it a recipe is because you don't have to follow it exactly. These are guideposts, designed to inspire you, and they'll carry you through. So ask yourself, where does the story really begin? This isn't a literal question. You don't scrunch your brows and find the answer. You like go for a walk outside, you take a bath, you do the dishes with this wondering, where does the story really begin? Understanding that the archetype of the storyteller is the spider. You know, she's the weaver of the many layers and dimensions. So when I tell a story about when I got cancer, it doesn't start on the day that I was sitting across from the doctor who diagnosed me. It actually started when I was 4 years old. And on my wall was this beautiful tapestry that had been hand woven by a friend of my mother's. And it was of this woman that was giving away flowers to a bunch of children. And on that tapestry, it read, "Give what you have, Leah. To someone else, it may mean more than you dare to think." And I remember being really young. I was like just 4 or 5, and I'm just learning how to read. And I can't understand it for the life of me. Give what you have to someone else. It may mean more than you dare to think. Until there I was, sitting across from the desk from this doctor who had just handed me this thick contract that said that they were about to cut across my throat, and there was a good chance I was going to lose my voice. And for the first time, I knew what I had. So again, that's an example of, you know, if I was just sitting there being like, I'm going to tell you about my thyroid cancer, it's like, I don't know that I would have pulled in that moment. But again, you're going in for a sacred story. What's the medicine? What's the meaning? What's the universal truth in it? What's the bigger story? Allow yourself to be surprised and awed by what wants to be revealed to you and how different parts of your life connect to lead up to this one moment, to reveal the purpose and the meaning of your soul. Whatever, purpose, meaning of your soul, I don't know, but your soul path, let's say that. So let's go on to the next part, which is that universal truth, you know, that your story has a universal truth in it. And again, this is like that humble moment of allowing your story to reveal itself, allowing the wisdom of your story that connects it to all people in all time to present and to come as a gift through you. So as you do that, no scrunching of the brows, no egoic mind that knows exactly what it's all about. Just wonder, what is the universal truth in your story? You know, for me, what emerged in my story was that at that moment, when I'm sitting across from the doctor and he tells me that I could lose my voice, something happened. Because what you need to understand is that before that moment in my life, I had mastered the role of the victim. I knew all the lines. I could out-victim story anybody in the room. And I was just about to be given the throne and the tiara of Queen Victim. And I wanted out of the story, and I wanted out of that role. And in that moment, it was as if this escape hatch opened in the room, and I saw my way out, and I had no idea what was on the other side or where I was going to go or what I was going to do, but I jumped and I made a massive leap out of that story and into a new world and into a new way of living in the world. And I can thank thyroid cancer for that gift, for giving me a way out and for giving me a way in. So again, that's a little example of what's your universal truth. What was that threshold? What was your initiation? It's another way of asking, you know, what was that thing that all humans go through? You know, we all have moments in our lives where we come across and come against a moment where we're either going to continue the same way we've always been being, or the ways that we were taught to being, that moment of deciding and choosing who we most want to be in the world. And so that what wants to emerge in your story. Then we go into another section. And this other section is, who are your guides? You know, who got you through? Who's your Yoda? And again, listening. There's just this continued theme. I'm sorry, to keep, you know, that deep listening. For me, what got me through was a garden. You know, I don't know if you know how thyroid cancer works. When they take out your thyroid, the doctors actually don't know how much medicine to give you. Every single body is so different. So they just give you something and then they see how you respond. In my case, they gave me speed. I came out of the hospital dancing. I had so much energy. I asked my friends over. I was like, hey, first day out of the hospital, come on over. Let's build a 70-foot circular garden. And they're like, Leah, don't you think this is a little weird first day out of the hospital? I'm like, I got energy. Might as well use it. And thank God, because 2 weeks later, I set into a deep, deep, deep depression. And that garden was all I had that got me through. And before that time, I can't say that I knew anything about gratitude, and I didn't know anything about prayer. But that garden gave me a place to learn. It gave me a place to put my feet in the earth and to listen. And every morning I would walk that outer circles of the garden, and somehow it taught me gratitude. And I would just walk that with statements of what I was grateful for every single day. And on my way out the circle, I stepped and I walked with the prayers for the life I most wanted to live in. And that was my way through, and that was my way out. So again, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, I made it through the minefield. I'm going to throw some breadcrumbs back, and I'm going to show you one way out, and you're going to find your way out. And everyone's going to hear something different in your story. And it's going to wake up people's memories, and it's going to wake up possibility, and it's going to wake up new ways of people seeing and experiencing their own lives and their own stories. And that's what we're doing as we carry these. Now, you want to finish your story because you're going to, as soon as we get off in a couple of minutes, you're going to go and you're going to write your story in 10 minutes. And you can do that. You've got this. You do not have to overthink this. You don't have to toil this. I wrote that story in 10 minutes. And so what I invite you to do is you can just story map the story. You can just write it out in bullet points. You know the story, it's your story. It doesn't have to be the exact words. You just want it to have life in it. But ending a story, that requires skill and craft. And maybe you don't have a lot of time to do that or the experience to do that. So what I invite you to do is something that John O'Donohue teaches, which is about end your story with a blessing. And they say for every blessing that you tell, it comes back to you, quadruple fold. So it's a beautiful way to end a story. And to end a story in that way, imagine, what is the metaphor of your story? And then allow yourself to think about what that might be. And so it's the mechanism of it is kind of if then. So if you find yourself in a dark and stormy night in the center of the ocean and your ship has sunk, and it seems all is lost and everything you cared about is gone and has crumbled, then may the light of the moon shine a light across the ocean and guide you safely to shore. So you've ended with a blessing, and people are like, they feel all yummy. They're not even paying attention that you didn't finish your story, that you didn't make up the perfect ending, because you brought it to a nice, sweet conclusion in a sweet and generous way. So that is our class for today. I definitely strongly recommend that you go and write your story. For those of you who just came for the class, that was it. For those of you who are tempted and tantalized by this strange thing called sacred storytelling, and you'd like to learn a little bit more about how you might be able to do it with me specifically, I'm going to take about 4 or 5 minutes and just tell you about a couple of things that are happening. And so that's what we'll be doing. So I'll end you with a quote just because it's good to end with a quote. And the reason why we end with a quote in terms of beginning and ending is it is acknowledging our place in the world of storytelling. It's acknowledging our place of saying, we're part of a long lineage of people who have been here before us, who have committed themselves to language and to story. And so it's nice to stand in the resonance of what they've brought. So this is by Stephen Jenkinson. Act as if you are people of consequence so that I can treat you as such and let you matter. What must have happened to people who unconsciously agreed that the best presence in this world is to have no consequence in this world? It's a velvet gauntlet, this idea of being of consequence. It doesn't clink when it hits the ground, but you can feel it. It would be proper to perceive that there is consequence to us being here. I just love that. So there you go, by Stephen Jenkinson. So there's a couple ways that we can continue to play. One of them is this Saturday, the 25th. I'm teaching an all-day long storytelling ceremony. And this is part of an 11-part series, which is working with story as a form of initiation. And the theme of this month is giving your gifts. So we'll be going in for a long day of both getting to work on your own in groups. I'll never talk this much, by the way. I don't ever talk this much during our classes. You guys get to do the talking and the creating and the playing. So even though it's a really long day and we're stepping into ceremony, we do get to step into that timelessness, and you aren't on front of the screen for 9 hours. There's a lot of break. There's a lot of interdisciplinary practice. We're always amazed at how quickly the day goes in terms of that. And it's a real opportunity that if you're in that moment of really listening for what it wants to emerge from you in these times, what is that? It's a strange thing, right? We're called human beings, but somehow so many of us got caught in the role of that human doingness. And animals, we understand their inherent value in their beingness, right? An indigenous perspective is that they have medicine and medicine to give. And the same thing with us. I think that we live in a world that doesn't always remind or expect that or want that from us, but it doesn't mean that we don't feel the calling, and doesn't mean that it's not necessary, needed. So this course is really designed to help you find all of those stories that you've been living in up to this point that might become the barriers to you being in and standing in the fullness of the gifts that you have to give, or also the callings, what has been calling you forward, what has emerged that you know and it's developed the gifts that you are here to give. So at the end, you will definitely stand in the wholeness of that deep knowing and embodiment. I don't usually say that you definitely get something, because it is an initiation, and you choose your own path through initiations. There's an element of mystery. You won't actually really know what's going to happen on the other side. And so I want to declare the truth in that piece, while also saying you will be given a process to go forth on that path. Then the other thing that's coming up is a new course called Sanctuary. And this is a course where we are looking deeply into, and it's a brand new course, so it's going to be hard for me to explain it exactly. What we're doing is it's a mystery school that works with story as mystery. And it understands that all the different stories and how we live in our life make up and build and develop the one big story that is our life. And so it invites you into living your biggest story. And so it's actually an entrance into the temple arts and into redesigning your life and redesigning your home and redesigning your stories in a group of people together. So when I send out this email, you'll get a link to how you can participate in that. And then a couple other things that are coming up. There's going to be a really fun class that is next Saturday that's all about integrating rhythm and song into your stories. And I'm co-teaching that with a very talented percussionist. And so if you just want to come and play for a couple of hours, we're going to create vision stories, and we're going to play with sound and song, and that's just going to be playful and joyful. So all of the emails, after this goes out, you'll get an email and it'll have links to all those kind of good things. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer any. Yes.
Is rhythm and song on the 25th?
That is, hold on, I think it's on May 2nd.
Oh, okay.
What's on May 5th is the story as ritual, story as initiation.
Okay.
Okay. Well then, I will leave you on this beautiful day. I'll take you all off on mute, and we can say goodbye to each other.
Bye. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Very well.
Thank you.
Very lovely.
Have a lovely day.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
I'm fired up. I'm ready to go.
Good.
I'm going to join you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good day.